Kia ora koto katoa. Welcome to the final day of our Activist in Residence series with Byron Clark. It's been such a joy to have you with us, Byron, over these last few days. We tried somewhat of a different framework for doing this Activist in Residence series, in the sense that you're our first activist with whom we tried to do this on an online setting. Sort of on one hand, we missed having you physically here in the center. On the other hand, it's been great to be able to actually work online with you, listen to you, and really witness the kind of impact you're creating with your work. Also, it's particularly salient to have you, Byron, with us at this point or the juncture of the work of CARE, as we ourselves have negotiated attacks by hate groups and various kinds of digital disinformation campaigns. Today we are going to share the key insights from our white paper. This is the paper that Byron and I discussed, dialogued on, and crystallized some strategies with. The paper will be ready within the next couple of weeks, and then it will be published on the CARE platform. So once again, welcome. And we have titled our white paper as Strategically Resisting Hate. We will begin by defining for you once again. We have covered these concepts throughout the week, but we will offer short definitions of what we mean by disinformation, what we mean by hate, and how are these two concepts related. Byron, over to you.
Thanks, Mohan. Thanks again for the opportunity to do this residency with CARE. So we looked at in our white paper disinformation and hate. So disinformation is false information that is usually designed with the purpose of influencing people towards often a hateful ideology. So we're going to look at a case study there, which is the campaign against the UN Global Compact on safe and orderly migration. And hate, of course, is the hatred of marginalized groups, whether that be Muslims or other ethnic groups or religious groups or gender groups, sexuality, so forth, and how that's spreading online through social media. Back to you then.
Thank you, Byron. So, Byron described for you the strategic nature of disinformation. So there is a political economy that underlies disinformation and hate, meaning that there are powerful political and economic interests that profit from disinformation and hate, and they strategically, therefore, disseminate disinformation and hate. And this is a key point when we think about the concept of platform capitalism. Platform capitalism refers to the extractive logics that drive platforms. Global platforms today are some of the largest corporations, and these corporations are driven by profit. And within that logic of profit, hate plays a key role in terms of driving up audiences and in enabling the consolidation of power and control. So both disinformation and hate are connected with a narrative structure, a structure of storytelling that fundamentally works through this process of othering. So if you were to look at a piece of disinformation or sort of a digital example of hate, what you would see in there is the work of othering through the production of misinformation, through the production of inaccurate information. This can take the form of actually inverting truth. This can take the form of creating images. So we often see images that are taken from one context and misused in another context. This can also take the form of taking an actual event and giving it a lens or a frame that serves the purpose of hate. Now, one of the things that we wanted to outline in our white paper is that this nexus of disinformation and hate has tremendous consequences, particularly for minorities, particularly for marginalized communities that are already at the margins of society. So, be it in the struggles of indigenous communities, so within the context of Aotearoa, the struggles of Maori, be it in the struggles of Muslims, be it in the struggles of transgender communities, the everyday experiences of being marginalized are further exacerbated by the flows of disinformation and hate. So, within that sense, there are tremendous effects on the health and well being of those at the margins. And this, of course, then constitutes threat to social cohesion, particularly in the form of further erasing and silencing those at the margins, and often, within dominant systems that already have existing normative structures that create forms of marginalization. Disinformation and hate works further to silence and erase those voices and lived experiences, and at the same time attack the right to life and livelihood of communities at the margins. And this process, of course, works through often the reworking of majoritarianism, the idea of speaking to a majority through populist narratives to threaten democracy. And we have seen the ways in which these threats to democracy have played out within the region. For instance, in Australia, we have seen how this plays out in the US. So, this actually is a threat to democracy across the globe. Byron, over to you.
Thank you. So the case study that we look at in the white paper is the campaign against the UN Migration Compact, or the UN Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. So this was started by far-right groups in Europe and then spread through social media, in particular YouTube. There was one study done by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue that found of the top 100 videos about the compact, 75 were created by people they categorized as being far-right conspiracy theorists or anti-migration populists. And that campaign spread to Aotearoa with a petition to Parliament and with rallies in the major cities. Next slide there. So at these rallies, politicians from smaller right-wing parties would speak, including Stephen Berry representing the ACT Party, who's in the photo there, as well as then Deputy Leader of the New Conservative Party, Aotearoa, who spoke in Auckland, and I believe the then leader of the party spoke at one of the Christchurch rallies as well. So from the extreme, it then went to these more mainstream organisations, and as well as using social media. The people who are participating in this disinformation campaign also utilised talkback radio, which led to News Talk ZB publishing this article I've referenced there. Callers overwhelmingly against NZ signing up to UN Migration Compact, which was a compilation of the calls that they received. And this made it appear that this was a large campaign when really it was a small fringe, but they were having this impact on the mainstream. And as a result of all of this, the National Party then came out in opposition to the compact, adopting some of the talking points of the campaign. So Judith Collins tweeted that New Zealand must never cede its sovereignty to the United Nations, probably knowing full well that that's not what signing this non-binding compact around migration would do. We also talk about in there the methodologies of tracking hate online. A big part of it is just following these social media channels. New Zealand has probably proportionally the same amount of hate and disinformation on social media as other countries, but because we have quite a small population and in absolute numbers, the number of these YouTube channels and Facebook pages is quite small, so they can be monitored reasonably easily. There are also tools that can be used like SMAT, the social media analysis tool, which will allow you to search a number of these alt tech social media platforms like Gab and Telegram. So the picture there is an example, just looking for what people are talking about Jacinda Ardern on some of these channels. And the other method is actually infiltrating some of the private groups, which is something that investigative journalists like Elliot Weir, who writes for the Otago University Student Magazine Critic, did. He spent 6 months inside Action Zealandia, who are a white supremacist group, and he wrote about that experience there, and gave us some quite useful insights for researchers by doing that. Right. Strategies that we look at, a big one is deplatforming. This is one of the most effective ways to stop the spread of hate online. So this is having somebody who is using social media to spread hate and disinformation removed from that platform, giving them less ability to reach a wide number of people with this disinformation. It also reduces the chances that someone engaging with more moderate content will unwittingly encounter more extreme content. Because often the way that the algorithms on these sites work, if somebody watches a reasonably mainstream video, they may then be directed to something a little more extreme, and then from there more extreme too. And that's how people can become self-radicalized online through the disinformation on social media. We talk about policy responses to this. A big one is that there are standards for broadcast media that predate the social media era, meaning a publisher like Facebook or YouTube is not accountable to the public the way that, say, RNZ or TV3 is, who have to abide by these codes of practice and are responsible for the content that they air on their platforms, whereas in the examples of Facebook and YouTube, they have their own internal community guidelines, but they're not accountable to the public through an organization like the BSA. The other strategy we look at is creating counter narratives. Pre-bunking is a term that we use there. This is exposing people to correct information before they're exposed to misinformation. It's more effective than debunking, which is when you counter the misinformation afterwards. Pre-bunking is equipping people with the knowledge and the information that they need to recognize misinformation and disinformation online, so that they're not susceptible to them believing it. And we also talk about how communities affected by misinformation and hate need to be resourced to create counter narratives, whether that's communities being targeted by misinformation and hate against them, or whether it's communities who are being targeted with the misinformation to try and be drawn into it. They need to be resourced to create those counter narratives against what is being spread.
Another strategy that we discussed is the need for building voice infrastructures. Now, this is a key methodological framework that we use in our work at CARE, drawing upon the culture-centered approach. And this argues that we need to build voice infrastructures for communities at the margins of the margins. This recognizes that ongoing forms of erasure actually perpetuate marginalization, and then communities that are very much at the extremes of the margins lack access to voice infrastructures to raise their voices, to have access to policies, and to actually be meaningfully heard. So we have constantly seen this across global contexts, and certainly in Aotearoa, where you have communities at the margins that have often voiced and articulated their everyday experiences with hate, and then talking about not really having a space to be heard. So, predating the Christchurch attack, for instance, there were a wide array of Muslim organizations that talked about the Islamophobia in Aotearoa and the everyday experiences of Muslims within the context of Islamophobia. And then talking about not really having spaces where those voices were heard. Unfortunately, that erasure continues to be perpetuated. In our work at CARE, we continue to hear from the voices of Muslims in Aotearoa who articulate their experiences of being unheard, who articulate their experiences with Islamophobia, and then actually not having spaces where those experiences are given legitimacy or appropriate steps are taken to address the climate of Islamophobia. Therefore, creating these infrastructures where voices of those at the margins are able to articulate their everyday experiences, but more importantly, be able to create anti racist strategies and solutions is vital. So, this turns to the question of agency and this process of building voice infrastructures enables the agentic capacities of communities at the margins of the margins and builds listening infrastructures in dominant spaces, processes, and policy frameworks for those voices to be heard and for those voices to be responded to in adequate ways. And this process then disrupts the erasures, which we argue is a fundamentally racist process. So the erasure of those at the margins of the margins, which forms the everyday processes of multicultural crown frameworks is itself racist. So this racism then enables the ongoing perpetuation of hate and disinformation. In that sense, therefore, to challenge the frameworks of disinformation and hate, we have to figure out ways in which we can build infrastructures in communities, particularly for the voices of those at the margins of the margins. This then also connects to the concept of community organizing. So we recognize that hate and disinformation spreads, secures a form of virality through digital platforms that enables it to perpetuate itself, but also for actually impacting communities and the lives of communities. So, in that sense, as we outlined in the beginning, the online world has tremendous impact on the offline world in our everyday communities. And in that sense, the strategies that we have outlined for countering hate on the platforms, for policies to address hate on the platforms, has to be complemented by everyday organizing in communities, where these everyday forms of organizing in communities build structures for countering disinformation, for countering hate, where these everyday organizing frameworks create spaces for critical literacy, building habits of critical literacy for communities to actually interrogate the disinformation that is being circulated, to interrogate the strategy and the political economy behind that disinformation, and to then engage to that process in building collective solidarity. So crafting solidarities across struggles in that sense is vital. Now, one of the key strategies that underlies disinformation and hate is one of divide and rule. So those that consolidate both political and economic power in the hands of few often work through strategies of divide and rule. So to counter those divide and rule strategies, it is vital that a wide array of struggles connect across and with each other. For instance, it is vital that anti-racist struggles, um, uh, anti-racist struggles of migrants connect with anti-racist struggles of Tangata Whenua, which then connect with working class struggles and the struggles that emerge from within unions. And this then becomes a space for building a broader coalition that challenges the hegemonic forms of distributing hate and disinformation. So, building anti hate politics then emerges from this. Because, as Byron pointed out, one of the things that we have seen is the ways in which mainstream politics is invested in and profits from the dissemination of hate. And here, another key point that we want to highlight is that the political marketing, the campaigning strategies that often drive mainstream politics are based upon principles of segmentation, political marketing, and political targeting, and which therefore also then orients mainstream political actors to accommodating disinformation and hate, to the extent that that process of accommodation speaks to an audience base or a voter base. So it's really vital that we work toward building a politics that is fundamentally anti-hate, anti-racist, and hold our politicians to account within that context. So if you, for instance, have a digital platform that carries hate content, and you see on that same platform advertising or political marketing by the mainstream political parties, speak out, write to those political parties, engage them, ask their political commitments to challenging disinformation and hate. So that kind of everyday work of seeking to transform politics has to be a vital part of dismantling the infrastructures of hate. And this then also connects with the concept of connecting. Connecting refers to looking beyond localized contexts to building networks across spaces. Now, one of the things that Byron beautifully pointed out is how the networks of hate operate across contexts and how disinformation and hate flows globally. So, disinformation that is connected with QAnon and seeded within the US context finds its way into the context of Aotearoa and becomes a way to shape the politics in Aotearoa. Now, that's a powerful example for us to think through then in terms of the politics of challenging that. And the work of challenging that then has to also be global in scope in terms of looking beyond local struggles and local contexts to actually seeing how we build international connections, international networks that seek to dismantle disinformation and hate. And then finally, we come to this question of sustaining, because if you think about the broader concept of political economy of disinformation and hate, then one of the things we recognize is that disinformation and hate are driven by some of the largest global corporations, are driven by political parties, and therefore are driven by sources of power. So then the question for everyday people, for everyday communities, is that how do we sustain our anti-racist strategies, our anti-hate strategies, and how do we actually generate impact? So there is a lot to be thought through in terms of the kinds of strategic interventions we create that sustain everyday efforts, movements, organizing processes of social change. I will turn to you, Byron, for wrapping us up.
Thank you. So, really, to wrap up, what we highlight there in this white paper is just the importance of dismantling hate through, as we've talked about, having those policy changes that are needed, having those counter narratives created, and hopefully people will be able to read the white paper and get an understanding of how these networks of hate and disinformation operate, and then play a role in helping dismantle that. That's what I'd really like to see from this.
Kia ora. Namihi. Thank you so much, Byron. It's again been such a joy working with you on this. We look forward to you, our audience, our communities of activists engaging with this work, giving us feedback, and hopefully together, collectively, we can work toward dismantling hate. We will now go to our audience for questions. Byron, there is a question from Kay that says, interesting that ACT Party has a bill before Parliament to outlaw deplatforming at universities in the name of freedom of expression. This follows universities saying no to hosting alt-right speakers and anti-trans speakers on health and safety. of students' grounds.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, um, as I think I mentioned in the public talk earlier in the week, one of these people spreading hate and disinformation online had made a donation to the ACT Party before the last election, not necessarily because ACT is in line with those alt right beliefs, but because they see ACT's kind of free speech absolutism as being in their interests. And I think that when ACT is putting forward bills like this, they're aware of that, and they're aware of that audience that they're dog whistling to. Um, the context of universities is interesting because there's this idea of free speech or free expression that anyone can just be allowed to say anything anywhere, and that's really not how universities work. If you're a student at university and you hand in an essay full of misinformation that is factually incorrect, um, you will fail that essay, and you may fail that paper and not be able to continue. If you are submitting to a journal and what you're submitting is wrong, if it's misinformation, they will not publish it. They will not give you that platform for that. So academia is not a place where you can spread disinformation under the guise of freedom of expression. And I think some of these speakers, like alt right speakers or transphobic speakers, I think need to be challenged in that way as well, not just on these health and safety grounds, but challenged on the idea that you can't actually come to a university campus and use it as a way to spread disinformation.
So the other point that Kay makes is free speech in NZ and UK is sometimes used as a disguise to enable far-right or racist speakers to be provided with publicly funded platforms. The free speech unions have an impact on actions by more moderate right-wing politicians and policies, as we have already heard.
Yeah, and we have an example of that locally, I think, with the Free Speech Coalition that formed after Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux came to New Zealand and couldn't get a venue to speak at. This organisation formed, not openly supporting the things that Molyneux and Southern were saying, but supporting their abstract right to free speech, which they believed meant that the council-owned venues should allow them to have a platform. And this organisation, I think, raised several $1,000s towards a legal case on their behalf, which they then later lost. Um, but they've not raised a comparable amount of money for anyone else's free speech. I think we need to look at organisations that call themselves free speech unions or free speech coalitions and see whose free speech they are focusing their energy on, because there are all sorts of free speech and free expression issues that I think they are ignoring. And if they're just focusing on the free speech of fascists or transphobes or the alt right, and ignoring um, people who are facing consequences for being critical of certain countries' leaderships or certain political parties, or whistleblowers talking about issues in their industries or their workplaces, if that free speech is not being focused on these groups, are they really about free speech, or are they just about defending a particular kind of speech?
Mhm. I'm so glad you brought up the example of the Free Speech Union, and I wanted to give you an example within that context, Byron. So if you think about David Cumin, someone who sits on the Free Speech Union, and at the same time is quite engaged with portraying anyone that critiques Israel and its Zionist strategies as terrorists and extremists, and through that logic seeks to silence them. It really
Mm.
kind of brings up the hypocrisy of the free speech union.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I also see this within the context of the right-wing forces of Hindutva at work, right? Which is that they are all for advocating for free speech to the extent that that speech is supportive of the dominant structures and at the same time seeking to silence any critique of Hindutva,
Mm.
and labeling it as Hinduphobia. So this is really interesting, again, in terms of the work of power and control, and how those that are actually seeding disinformation are also then invested in categorically deploying free speech to support their politics of hate.
Mm. Certainly.
There's a question from Mahbub. He says, disinformation and misinformation challenge the freedom of expression. How the higher educational institutions work more effectively to overcome the misinformation or disinformation?
Mm. Yeah, I think definitely they're challenging freedom of expression, and the as well as the disinformation and misinformation, the hatred that is there is challenging free expression. Um, as I've talked about, I've, as a result of the activism I do, received numerous threats. I've had a previous home address posted online, with people then asked to send me threats with my home address, things like that. This is an attempt to silence my freedom of expression by having that threat of violence if I express myself. So again, some of these people will defend their own hateful speech with the grounds that they have freedom of expression, they have freedom of speech. Will then happily see threats of violence deployed to silence others, and the threats that I get as a Pākehā man in this space are less than what I have seen others, particularly some of the Maori women have been active in deplatforming Lee Williams. Some of the hate and threats that's been directed at them is much worse than what I've got, and the same for like Muslims in this space who are already victims of a lot of hate and Islamophobia. If they speak out specifically against the people spreading that, they will draw more hatred there. So that's a limit on their freedom of expression by these people spreading hate and disinformation.
Mm. This is
Um,
a powerful point, really, Mabubur and Byron, because what you're outlining is that those that are already at the margins of the margins, whose voices are erased historically through the dominant structures, are far further marginalized through these processes of seeding
mm,
disinformation and hate. The one point I also want to make with regard to that, which has been quite revealing for me, is that to the extent that many groups who are deeply marginalized, then um, the ways in which they have to muster up courage, energy to actually speak up and witness hate at cost, like you're highlighting, Byron, that hate often then gets directed at them. And within that context, then they say that when they speak up, there is very little our policy structures currently are able to do. So one of the things I've heard multiple activists at the margins talk about is the limits to the Human Rights Commission and the role of the Office of the Race Relations Commissioner, particularly in addressing these forms of hate, which then actually further perpetuates the marginalization and disenfranchisement. Did you have any thoughts on that, Byron, in terms of the effectiveness of that framework, which is apparently created to address racism?
mm. Yeah, I'd agree that there's a real limitation there for what it can do. I don't think I have the answers for um, how to overcome those limitations, but it's definitely something that needs to be talked about, needs to be looked at. There, the limitations of what we have in place currently for dealing with racism, with discrimination and hate.
Hmm. Another point that Kay raises is that the Free Speech Coalition has morphed into Free Speech Union NZ. The Free Speech Union was born out of the Free Speech Coalition, it's in quotes. It originally described itself as a sister group to FSU UK, but has deleted those references from its website.
Mm.
So then she goes on to say rewriting and sanitizing previous versions is used by many groups to gain public acceptability. Or having a polite public voice and a less polite alternative voices, like the use of Cameron Slater, aka Will Oil, for directed attacks. Has NZ moved on from dirty politics, or is the same playbook still running?
Mm. Yeah, and Cameron Slate is definitely still active in this space. I mean, whale oil has gone. He has a new site called the BFD, where a lot of these people are given a platform um, on there as well. So I think
Hmm.
he's a name that's not going to disappear from our politics for some time, and it's worrying when I see mainstream politicians still engaging with him the way that they did in that dirty politics era, because the people he's platforming now, I think, are in many cases even worse than the sort of content he was platforming, um, a few years ago with whale oil.
Hmm. Byron, I want to, I mean, thanks for that response. And I want to push on that a little bit in terms of, again, the political economy question. Um, are there mainstream politicians in Aotearoa that are funding, supporting economically, financially, some of these groups that would otherwise be seen as fringe? Again,
Mm.
do we have any kind of policy frameworks that enable us to track that?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure about funding these groups necessarily, but there's definitely a few people in politics who will um, often dog whistle to these groups and sort of give the impression that they are on the same side. Sometimes it can backfire a little bit. I mentioned ACT and David Seymour promoting his free speech absolutism. David Seymour was confronted at a meeting in Ashburton by Lee Williams after Lee Williams lost his job for his racist YouTube channel, and effectively told him on camera that that was the consequences of his own actions, which is consistent with the sort of neoliberal libertarian politics of the ACT Party. But Lee Williams had thought of David Seymour previously as someone who was an ally to him. And so he made a video of this, which got a bit of media attention because it's quite becomes quite confrontational when Williams realizes that David Seymour doesn't actually want to line up beside somebody who's known as somebody spreading hate online. Um, he wants the benefits of being able to dog whistle to these groups, but doesn't want the negative association with them. And a similar thing in his response to media asking about him accepting a donation from Mike Allen, who had threatened to destroy mosques, and then did a fundraiser for ACT. There's some other politicians as well that I haven't kept as close an eye on as I'd perhaps like to in the campaign against the UN Migration Compact, as well as having Judith Collins tweet that New Zealand shouldn't give up its sovereignty. We saw Jerry Brownlee tell News Hub that the compact would result in pretty much open borders, which he should have known full well that it wouldn't have. But then there were a couple of, at the time, first-term MPs, Simeon Brown and Chris Pink, who were engaging with a lot of the misinformation and disinformation around the UN Migration Compact. And I worry that maybe some of those more backbench MPs that we don't hear a lot from, are engaging a bit more with that fringe of politics. And I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on and have some accountability for there. Just as I've tried to make David Seymour more accountable for the donation he accepted, I think there's probably a few others in the house that maybe need some attention and some accountability as well.
Mhm. There's a follow-up question to this by Kay, which goes into the structural questions. And it would be actually lovely to also hear some of the voices of our, Maori activist colleagues with regard to this question, which is, the legacy of colonization and structural racism continue to benefit descendants of the white settlers. Why should the masters support change? Does the Waitangi tribunal have enough teeth, or is it another structure to delay justice?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a big question. I think bringing up that legacy of colonization is really important when discussing these issues of hate and misinformation. Um, in the white paper, we quote Tina Nata, who's written a bit about this and about how Maori are often the target of disinformation campaigns and have a lot of good reason to be distrustful of the state of media and even of the scientific establishment due to that history that's there with colonization. And when we talk about white supremacy, I think it's important that we see it not just as an aberration from the norm, but look at the actual white supremacist history of this country, of living in a white settler colony where the people who colonized these islands believed that they were part of a superior race and that the supposedly inferior race who lived here would then die out. And I think that anyone working in the space where we're looking at white supremacy needs to be aware of that history, of that legacy. Um,
Mahbub has a follow-up question that connects to the question of funding. He says the far-right groups are funded by some organizations locally or internationally. Um, how can that funding be controlled?
mm, yeah, it's hard to know exactly where funding for some of these different groups is coming from. Um, in the case of Action Zealandia, who are a white supremacist group, um, we know from a leaked police memo that was sent to financial institutions that the police are interested in um, certain transactions that are going to them, or monitoring transactions um, for certain things like a large amount being spent on publishing like stickers and posters and things, which is one of the main offline propaganda tasks of Action Zealandia. So I think that's something that police are looking at a little bit. Um, One of the things about social media is that the far right has been able to spread a lot of hate and disinformation without necessarily needing a lot of funding. So, like Lee Williams' YouTube channel essentially was him filming things on a smartphone and then uploading them. He didn't need a lot of a production budget to do that, and was still able to reach thousands of people. Um, Nonetheless, we know that he was getting some funding because when, particularly after he lost his job and was trying to get more money from his audience, Westpac actually closed down his bank account because it was being used for something other than what he'd told them, and I think that was because it was getting a large number of probably small donations, possibly some of them even from overseas, which maybe triggered some sort of anti money laundering rule or something like that. So when somebody's got an audience like that, there are people in that audience who are giving them funding, and I think a lot of that's probably coming locally. Um, One thing I've looked at as well is there's a talk show that streams on GTV, which is a network owned by Miles Guo and former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, and I know that the the New Zealand-based hosts of that were asked by Himalaya New Zealand to host a show, and Himalaya New Zealand is the sort of the local wing of Miles Guo's sort of international movement, the New Federal State of China, which is opposed to the Communist Party of China, but is also through his media organizations like GTV, is known for spreading a lot of misinformation and disinformation, including QAnon conspiracy theories and so forth. Um, I don't know if there's any actual funding going from like Himalaya New Zealand to this talk show, or whether it's just they've been given the platform though. But that's something I'd really like to see. Maybe an investigative journalist or someone try and find out, because it would be really interesting to know if there is funding coming in for this misinformation and what sort of funding that is, how big it is. And I think in the case of not so much a hate group, but definitely a disinformation group, the anti-vaccine organisation Voices for Freedom, they've produced 2 million leaflets to put in people's letterboxes, as well as a magazine, and they're quite glossy, quite professional looking. There's definitely some money behind that. I don't know if it's just coming from their supporters locally making small donations, or if they're getting support from somewhere else, from some wealthy benefactor, whether that's someone here or overseas. But again, I'd really like to see an investigative journalist look into that sort of thing, and see if they can get us some answers.
Mm. You know, this is a really interesting question, also within the context of our work with Hindutva, because one of the things that becomes quite interesting and worth examining is our Hindutva-related media entities or platforms that are clearly circulating Islamophobia, hate, and disinformation that is located within the Hindutva infrastructure. Are those able to position themselves as multicultural organizations, for instance, speaking to a migrant community, and therefore be able to attract crown funding or state
Mm.
funding and be funded by different government entities? So that's a really that's been a really interesting question for us. And I guess, Byron, the example of Apna TV carrying Talanoa Sao could be an example of that, because that's clearly a source that is propagating the disinformation and white supremacist ideology and the hate
Mm.
connected to that. But at the same time, it is positioning itself as an entity that is speaking to a Pacifica audience, being connected to a mainstream platform that is located within the context of South Asian diaspora. So I think that funding question is really powerful also in terms of whether our government actually has
Mm.
funded any of their productions or their content.
Absolutely, yeah.
Kay has another point referring sanitization. In May 2012, the founding members of the Governing Council of FSU NZ includes Elliot Ikeley, politician. By August, his name is dropped. In July, FSU NZ announced Free Speech Union welcomed Judith Collins as member. Some people speculate that others within FSU are trying to position the National Party and its communications to appeal to a range of information critical voters.
Mm. Yeah, I remember seeing that at the time, that Elliot Ekalay was listed as part of the governing council, and then disappeared. It'd be interesting to know what happened then, whether he's resigned, or what his reasoning behind that was. Um, Ekalay is an interesting character, because a couple of years ago, he was not quite perhaps mainstream, but he was being invited on to like TVNZ's breakfast program as a political commentator, to give a conservative perspective. And there's nothing inherently wrong with having a conservative perspective in our media, but as the new Conservative Party began to ally themselves more and more with figures on the far right, they were promoting a couple of Lee Williams videos on their Facebook page, for example. And now Igale, who's resigned as deputy leader, is hosting Talanoa Sao, where they platform people like the QAnon conspiracy theorist Damien Dement, as well as like the Samoan anti-vaxxer Edwin Tamasisi. I think that Elliot Ekalay has been pushed a little bit more back to the fringe of politics from where he was a couple of years ago, and I do wonder if he became a name that the FSU didn't necessarily want associated with them, but can only speculate there.
Hmm. You know, the other thing also, Byron, which is quite interesting with Elliot Ikeley is sort of the 1 degree of separation or no separation at all in terms of the link with the very explicit white supremacist articulators. So, I was looking at the Apna disinformation that was targeting Care and Herald for doing the story on Hindutva. And, one of the things that was quite striking is that story being shared by Ikle. And then, when you go into his platform, you see right there, you scroll down and there's Carol Soki, right? And but then the other context is that it is the same piece of disinformation then that is also shared by mainstream community leaders and politicians. So this web becomes so interesting in terms of the ways in which that information flows.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see that, see those networks there, and you can see how disinformation gets from the margins into something more mainstream there.
Mm. Kay has another point, and I think, Kay, this is a really good question. There have been suggestions that right-wing politics within India are also using religious prejudice to enable acquisition of property, as, for example, with Muslim people losing property when the owners are disenfranchised. Absolutely. In fact, this is one of the ways in which urbanization and city making and urban restructuring has worked within the context of India, particularly in terms of zoning laws and property ownership laws that have actually worked to keep within certain cities then Muslims out of the particular spaces. This has also then worked within the narratives of smart capital, smart city, artificially intelligent cities. So you see a number of these smart city initiatives that at the same time work to disenfranchise Muslims from these spaces in terms of who will belong. So pretty much the imaginary of the smart city or the smart future is the Hindutva city that is embedded within the concept of the disenfranchisement of Muslims. So really interesting question and something worth looking at in terms of
Mm.
the politics of disenfranchisement, particularly when it gets scripted into national policy and state-making policy. Another question Kay asked, Byron, maybe you could address this. Who benefits from various purges? So often religion is used as an excuse to grab property. Even going back to actions in Europe against so-called witches, many of the targets were widows and independent women, and if they were convicted of being a witch, their property was claimed by local politicians, often those who made the accusations. Who gains from current attacks?
Mm. So are you referring again to India there, Kay, to these
To, I
property
suppose
confiscations?
the question, Byron, is to India, but also within the broader question in terms of the political economy and the profiteering
Okay.
from it.
Mm.
So, like, would you be able to speak a little bit about how this kind of hate actually profits?
Mm. Yeah, so but in terms of profiting from hate, there is, as I mentioned, the money that's gained from some of these people through their audiences, whether that's Lee Williams or some of the others. They do get um, donations from the true believers in what they're saying. Um, but more concerning, I think, is the profits that's gained from social media companies like Facebook and YouTube. And there's been a lot published, particularly as quite recently with Facebook. There's been the former employee who's acted as a whistleblower about some of their policies and things. And I think a lot of these platforms have not just turned a blind eye to disinformation and hate, but have actually been able to profit from it because it keeps people engaged with the platforms, keeps their eyeballs on the screen for the advertisers, and it's actually been almost within their interest not to do something about this because it can be quite profitable for them to leave that there.
Yeah. In fact, Byron, it's really interesting if you look at the reports that have emerged within the backdrop of the Facebook whistleblower talking about sort of the Facebook policies with regard to disinformation and hate. And one of the things that she points out is that Facebook has had that knowledge that disinformation and hate actually goes viral, that actually it spreads much faster in an accelerated pathway compared to other forms of information. But the question is, why would it be interested in, as a private corporation, in monitoring that or regulated that? Because it precisely profits from that logic, doesn't it? So, in that sense, also, it really brings up an interesting question about self regulation and platforms, digital platforms like Facebook and Twitter, auto regulating vis a vis what is the role of our governments, and how can we hold our governments responsible for holding these large corporations to account, right?
Mm. So,
There is a question from Mahbub, and he brings up the Rohingya case, and that's a powerful case study because that's a case study of the ways in which digital infrastructures have been deployed to, really constitute and make up a genocide. So he asks, the Rohingya people of Myanmar are innocent victims of state-sponsored hate. It is also said that online hate is playing a vital part in the Rohingya genocide. How can state-sponsored hate be controlled or minimized?
mm.
I think, yeah, go ahead, Byron.
Yeah, I think it's an important question because one of the things we've been talking about in the context of hate and disinformation in Aotearoa is um, possible policy changes to make these platforms more accountable to the public through something like broadcasting standards that we have for television and radio. But in the case of state-sponsored hate, you don't necessarily want to have the state having that power to um, be controlling what can't be said on a platform or what can be said. So I think this is something that needs to be thought about in terms of the policy changes here, and I think in a global sense as well, it is something to think about there. I think we don't hear enough in the English speaking world about the role that online hate has played in the Rohingya genocide, and also there's a similar case in Ethiopia where social media has played a big role in spreading hate, and I think we don't hear enough about those, and we need to look at that as well, because of course these platforms are global, and perhaps something needs to be done in the places these platforms are based to hold them more accountable, whether there can be any kind of legal action taken by victims against the platforms that have allowed this, what sort of precedent that could set. I think it's a big issue, and there's a lot of things that could happen and perhaps should happen, and there needs to be that wider discussion on how to do that, and how to get that in motion.
Yeah. And of course, you are seeing something in a very similar vein happen with India, with Hindutva, where the hate is being sponsored and circulated by actors that are connected to the state, but at least in terms of the ruling political party. So you have the IT cell of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party, that is deeply implicated in the circulation of hate. So I go back to the point that you're raising, Byron, because within that context, at the same time, what you're saying is that the same state is putting people that are critiquing the state into jail because they are dissenting against its policies, and it is doing so under its Sedition Act and deploying the Sedition Act to do so. So we have to complicate the state, and at the same time, we have to look at sort of building global platforms, seeing how we can leverage UN mechanisms, for instance, to actually hold nation states to account in their roles in
Mm.
disseminating hate. I want to go to a question that is raised by Kay, which is, with a dominant culture and capitalism rewarding historical theft and abuse, even where there is lip service to democracy now, How realistic is piecemeal reform to enable fairness for all? A bit muddled, but what outcome should activists be pursuing?
Yeah, I think that gets at a larger scope than just disinformation and hate online. But I think one of the things that we talk about a bit in this white paper is resourcing communities to have those counter narratives. And so one example of that would be properly resourcing the media that we have, like Maori television and iwi radio stations, and the Maori media that exists, which often covers a lot of these things that aren't covered in the more mainstream media. And I think having things like that to make people more aware of some of that history there, some of the history of colonization of this country, can be part of that much wider activist project towards is capable of enabling fairness for all. And I think that as well as Maori media, we definitely need something more for the Pacifica community to be able to push back on disinformation with some counter narratives, because Talanoa Sao that we've talked about presents itself as being this authentic Pacifica voice, while then spreading misinformation about vaccines and other issues there. So we need those counter narratives there. It's really good that we had like on TVNZ the fictionalized series about the Polynesian panthers. I think that made people a bit more aware of some of the history of the oppression of Pacifica people in this country. But there's scope to have more of that. And I think I've mentioned two quite reasonably large minority groups in Aotearoa, but there are others as well. And as Mohan's talked about, people on the margins of the margins. So you get this media which is portrayed as being like Indian media, but can be perpetuating some of these Hindutva ideas and actually marginalizing further some groups. So resourcing the people on the margins of the margins to do to create their counter narratives as well, I think is equally important. And this isn't the whole solution to all the various social issues that need to be overcome, but it can be a part of it.
Hmm. Byron, thanks for sort of outlining this. For instance, with APNA, just doing some research, it looks like NZOA funds some aspect of a particular show that is connected to APNA. And again, it is able to do so perhaps under the narrative of multiculturalism and hit the tick mark that it has actually now engaged a migrant diverse context, while at the same time actually supporting a platform that is disseminating misinformation and hate. So within that context, it also seems like good old critical literacy. It's really important. I remember growing up within a community organizing context, and that a lot of that work was literally working in communities at the margins of the margins to build critical literacy, to look at media narratives and dominant narratives and examine the play of power and control in them. It seems like uh, we have, with the neoliberal transformations, we have had lost sort of the investments of the state into public education, into adult education, and critical literacy. So perhaps that right there is something that we could look at.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a real need for media literacy in schools, but also for older generations. It's often talked about that there are older generations who grew up when media was just the daily newspaper and the 6 o'clock news and maybe a couple of radio stations, whereas now there is so much media, and a lot of it is misinformation or disinformation, or even if it's correct, it may present a very slanted narrative on things. So I think for older generations as well, it's important to develop that media literacy, to be aware of the narratives that they're consuming online, and how to critically evaluate the information that they're getting.
Yeah. Kay says critical literacy is so important. There's a shout out to you, Byron, and also to David if you're watching. Byron, work Byron and others like David Ferrier do on Twitter is every bit as important as academic analysis. Absolutely.
Yeah, I hope what I do is making a difference in that space.
Yes, and that's the kind of public critical literacy, right? That has to happen in communities and outside in public spaces, not just within academia. Absolutely, you know. So let's move toward wrapping up. Byron, I want to go to you. Just first of all, I want to thank you. What an incredible week it has been to have you with us. Thank you for spending your time with us, for educating us, and for creating this opportunity for learning for us. So, do you want to wrap up with some sort of parting thoughts?
Yeah, thank you again for hosting me for this week, for this residency. It's been really valuable to have some of this time and things to work on this white paper, to deliver the workshop and the public talk that's been done. And I'd really like to thank everyone who's come along to these events and engaged. I think it's really been some really good discussion and raised a lot of really good points to discuss.
Kia ora.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for joining, for staying with us through the week. For those of you that haven't been able to join because it's a weekday, please feel free to watch the conversation. It will be available on the CARE Facebook page as well as on the YouTube channel. Hopefully, we will continue to engage these ideas and hopefully we will actually see changes in our broader media and digital environments so that actually we can live in societies that are supportive of our health well-being and ways of living in cohesive democracies. So thank you once again, and thanks Byron for
Thank
being a
you.
part of this.